Welcome to the Baka Gaijin Show! The Baka Gaijin Show is a one-man mini-podcast done by myself, Zeke, Freek, and is also by and large a series of opinion pieces. The views expressed are indicative of no one other than myself. All rants are unscripted, so I may say stupid shit I'll regret later. Thank you for your continued understanding.
Welcome to the Baka Gaijin Show. You know, I'm a writer, so sometimes I like to talk about writing. If you don't like it, fuck you. Anyway, today I want to talk about writing characters and how I go about it, how I see other writers on Fiction Press and other sites go about it, and just generally the process of forming and writing characters. I've always believed that there's two major kinds of narratives, ones that are character-driven and ones that are plot-driven. Character-driven narratives are typically defined as generally the plot moves along at the pace of the characters, and this often means that it's a bit more bumpy and it can go back and forth because characters, just like people, make mistakes, lapses in judgment, miscalculations, things like that. It's generally defined by the characters' clash of personalities or personal histories, and you really feel like the story is being driven by their actions and their beliefs rather than just the plot happening, which is what a plot-driven narrative is. That is more when the plot moves along kinda on its own and the characters feel more like chess pieces being strategically moved about as the screenwriter, or just regular writer, I guess, writes out the scenario. Now, that doesn't mean events happen in a vacuum. Obviously, characters have to be there to instigate or react to them. But that's another key point, is that typically in plot-driven narratives, characters tend to be, not always, but tend to be a bit more reactionary, or possibly pro-actionary if the plot calls for it. It really depends. The difference between these two types of narratives really depends on what is essentially driving the story forward. But I've always had a preference for character-driven narratives. I guess because there's more engagement and involvement that way, and you feel more compelled. You feel more compelled to care when you feel like your character's actions and beliefs matter, I guess. I don't know. That's not to say that there's anything wrong with plot-driven narratives. It's just to say that I personally find them weaker a lot of the time. Not all of the time, but a lot of the time. Now, the first thing that comes to mind when visualizing a character is most likely going to be the visual, or their appearance, how they look. It seems kind of basic and surface level, but it's just a natural step when it comes to visualizing a character, is that you have to visualize what they look like. I mean, I hate to say it, but when we imagine people we know, we often think of what they look like before who they are. Unless, of course, we've never met them before, in which case, I guess we just kind of don't do that. Anyway, whatever. This is probably the least important step in the process. I mean, especially if you're like a novelist or someone who doesn't have to worry about illustrating or actually conveying the look of your character. I mean, with words, it's always important to give the audience a clear picture of what your character looks like, but truth be told, when it comes to designing a character, this is probably the least important step, so I won't spend any more time talking about it. So after you get through the appearance part of it, the next important step is figuring out what this character's role is in the story. And by that I mean generally, like, what do they do to help move the plot forward? And how important are they to the overall, narrative? You've got your main characters, your secondary characters, your supporting characters, things of that nature, And even among main characters, you might have to decide, is this the protagonist, the deuteragonist, the tritergonist, the tetragonist, the antagonist, all the gonists. This step is important because you need to be able to tell who you're supposed to focus on and what the viewpoints for your narrative are, especially if you're writing in third person and you're switching between multiple viewpoints. It helps to be aware of where the focus is, and from whose eyes are we going to see the world and thus the events of the story as it goes forward. The next step is their personality, which is basically how they act, how they seem, how they react to things, how they take action. Basically, just their personality, what makes them likable, what makes them not likable, their flaws and their virtues, negative and positive aspects. And it's important to have both. It's important to emphasize, this realism of it, and that these characters, they need to feel like people, and people are not perfect, and most of the time, they're not one note either. They have multiple facets, and they can hold beliefs that are hypocritical or even self-serving, I think the more complex you make it, the better. There's a simple test that I like to use to determine the depth of a character's personality, which is a simple test where you pick a character and you describe the character to someone like they've never heard of it before, and you do not mention anything about their role or their appearance or their profession or whatever, and you only talk about their personality, their beliefs, and what they do. You know what I'm saying? And the longer you can go on describing them without mentioning surface level things like appearance and role, then the deeper the character is. It's also important to learn the difference between fleshing out and development. I'll talk about development in a bit, but fleshing out basically is another facet of personality. Fleshing out basically means that we just naturally learn more about them. This is a natural process as the story progresses, that when your characters have more screen time or page time, and they do more things and they interact with more people, and the plot moves forward, we will naturally learn more about them. That is fleshing out. Speaking of fleshing out, another important facet of writing characters is nailing down their history. Their personal history, possibly how it relates to others, but in a more, strict sense, basically what happened in their past from birth until where they are now that determined who they are, and make sure that it makes some degree of sense. I mean, obviously everyone's different, people react to things in different ways, but generally you need, especially if they have more extreme personalities, it helps if you give them a history that sort of justifies or at least explains how they got to that point, if you know what I mean. Their personal histories may or may not be relevant to the overall narrative as a whole, but it's important that you at least, even if you're not going to put it on the page, it's important that you at least have it in your mind. Trust me, it actually comes through a lot. The more depth you give a character in your mind, the more it shows through on the page, even if you aren't explicit about it. That's not to say that you can't be explicit about it, that's just to say that it'll shine through in some fashion even if you aren't. So it's really helpful to have a character's personal history in mind when writing them. The next thing you need to worry about is their relationships. Their relationships to other characters. Who are their friends? Who are their enemies? Who are their lovers? Who were their lovers? Who were their friends? Who were their enemies? What are their relationships now? What were their relationships in the past? What will their relationships be in the future? I think a lot of writers suffer from a syndrome where they kind of write their characters in a vacuum without really giving too much thought to how they interact with other characters. And this, in my opinion, is a major mistake. One of the things I'm often praised for as a writer is my ability to create interesting and developed characters that are not only good in their own right, but also interact wonderfully with other characters and bounce ideas off of them, and they grow and change together, just like real people do. So determining a character's past, future, and present relationships is always a helpful thing that really helps flesh out the entire cast as a whole. It's really kind of a domino effect. You start with one, and then they influence another one, and another one, and another one, and soon enough, the whole cast becomes more developed in this way. The next thing you need to worry about is something that really more affects the narrative as a whole, which is if they're active players in the narrative, what are their motivations and goals? What do they want? What are they striving towards? Now, you don't always need this. It's not like you can't have a character that doesn't know what they want, or perhaps the whole point is that they don't know what they want. That could also be a thing. But when it comes to a story that really progresses, it helps if you have some idea where your characters are going and what they want. If you don't give them something to strive for, a lot of the times they'll just remain kind of static and in the background. And when they're static and in the background, they don't develop as much, and we don't learn as much about them because they're not taking as much action. So it really helps to have some idea of what the characters want and how they're going to go about getting it, or achieving it. The next thing is really important, and that's character development. Development is how a character grows and changes over time through events in the story or through interaction with others. It helps if you have sort of a starting point and then set different points along different paths of the narrative. At this point, he's this, he or she is this. And then they develop into this kind of person. They change in so-and-so in such ways. And then maybe they change back, or maybe they relapse, or maybe they change again. Change is a procedural process, and it's not always as straightforward as point A to point B, because sometimes people do relapse, and it's hard for people to change sometimes. They'll fall back into old habits, or they'll unintentionally make things worse for the people around them because of their change. Not all change has to be good, The most common kind of character development seems to be someone abandoning negative qualities in favor of positive ones. But character development can easily go in the opposite direction, abandoning positive qualities for negative ones. Or it could even flip-flop and go back and forth, where they lose some positive qualities, gain some negative ones, lose some negative ones, gain some positive ones. And sometimes if the setting is such a gray morality, things can become muddled enough where you stop thinking about it as positives and negatives, and you start thinking about how they're losing and gaining different traits. But this is an important step to making your characters feel believable and fleshed out and feel like real people, is if they grow and change over time, like real people do. Development and change is important because it helps people attach to the character, bond with the character in a way, feel like they really get to know them. And that's what makes them invested and engaged in their fate, their struggles, and what their ultimate fate is going to be. And speaking of ultimate fate, let's talk about conclusions, or their future, or the conclusion to their personal character arcs. Unlike real life, narratives don't go on forever. Eventually they have to end. When you start writing a character, you don't necessarily have to have a perfect, 100% accurate vision, but you should at least have some general idea of where you want your characters to progress and where you want them to end up at the end. If it's the kind of story with a high anyone can die rate, then maybe you need to determine which characters are going to be alive and dead. That's a basic thing, it's just an example though. Just have an idea of where you want your characters to go and where you want them to end up. What is the resolution to their character arc? Do they become a worse person overall, a better person overall, just a completely different person overall? Do they kind of loop back around to being generally the same person overall? Things like that, you really just need to have an idea of their future. What's going to happen to them beyond the story? It's not necessarily something the audience needs to know in explicit detail, but it's something that you should keep in mind, what's going to happen to them post-story. Anyway, this has just been a brief overview of what I think goes into writing, developed, well fleshed out, and interesting characters that people can really care about. This episode's been going for quite a long time, so I'm going to wrap it up really quickly here by just saying, Zeke Freak out, ciao ciao for now.